Hello, my name is Wolf, and this is a note from the probability field. This is the second section of a two-part discussion in which we're working to gain more complete perspectives on several major issues surrounding abortion. In particular, the constitutional, the medical, the religious, and one that gets a lot less attention in the media these days, the societal issues. I'm going to do my best to stick to the known facts and some valid data, and there's just a lot of information to go through, which is why we broke this into two parts. In the first section, we looked at the religious and the medical fields. In the second section, our aim is understanding the relevant constitutional and societal dimensions. So let's take in the constitutional parameters first. The Supreme Court is preparing to rule in a case that may decide the fate of abortion rights in America. In that regard, we are usually hearing about the 14th Amendment, Section 1, and sometimes the 9th Amendment. But we'll also take a look at the applicable potential of Article 3, Section 1, Article 6, Clauses 2 and 3, and the 10th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is usually cited along with the 14th. The 9th Amendment makes very clear that even though a specific right is not explicit in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that it does not exist, or that by virtue of it not being listed, that it can be violated. It is still a right, and it is still protected. The framers of the Constitution were, at least some of them, visionaries. They essentially created the Constitution as a living document that could be amended as the Republic evolved. They knew things would change, socially and morally, technically and economically, as the future continually becomes the present. So they constructed the Constitution to be able to respond by amendment, adapt but not change its core values or limit fundamental rights. Also, they felt setting down a list of specific rights guaranteed to citizens would imply that these rights were granted by the government and not the natural rights that all individuals, all peoples, should have from birth. And by specifically naming these rights, it would imply that those not specifically named are not protected. In this context, I find both originalist and the living constitutionalist approaches to discerning the meaning of what the founders wrote in the Constitution to be somewhat flawed. But we're not going to tour those rabbit holes today. We're going to stay on topic. So not surprisingly, along originalist lines, conservative Judge Alito, I will not call him Justice, as it does not appear to me that he is engaging in justice in this case. Anyhow, in his draft opinion, he states, and I quote, "The Constitution makes no mention of abortion," which factors into his opinion that Roe versus Wade should be overturned. Also, in reference to the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, about 3 years after the Civil War, Alito says it was only to protect the rights of former slaves and that some states enacted laws limiting abortion. So, did he not read the 9th Amendment, which was ratified in December of 1791? Which states clearly, and I quote, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." Or the 10th Amendment, also ratified in December of 1791, and I quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." The 14th Amendment was meant to clarify and amplify both the 9th and 10th Amendments for all people, including former slaves. It also made clear to the states, and I quote, "No states shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. There is no mention of former slaves in Section 1 of that amendment. There is one mention in Section 4, but not in relation to human rights. It's in relation to paying reparations for property lost during an insurrection. By my reckoning, Roe v. Wade was rightly decided under the 9th, 10th, and 14th Amendments. It should be clarified and strengthened by the Supreme Court, with all state laws limiting abortion access being superseded at the federal level by a person's constitutionally guaranteed rights. Medical science supports safe, ethical abortion procedures at minimum up to the time of medically mediated viability, and that's at like 22 to 24 weeks gestation. But the court should affirm a woman's right to choose the procedure up to at least the stage of developmental viability, which happens at about 28 weeks, and as medically necessary thereafter. Also, pursuant to the First Amendment, which prevents establishment of a national religion and also prohibits government, even on a non-preferential basis, to support any religion, specious religious-based arguments should not be allowed to be considered in this case. And the court needs to affirm that neither the federal government or the states have any standing to interfere with personal health care decisions between a patient and her doctor. I think this ruling should be made and affirmed under Article 6, Clauses 2 and 3 of the Constitution, which state in part, and I quote, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding, all federal and state officials shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution." With 66% of Americans supporting abortion rights, if the conservative majority on the court still chooses to go their own way by not upholding the rights guaranteed by the Constitution and or allowing religious arguments to color their ruling, even though they're supposedly appointed for life, we the people do have some recourse. As Article 2, Section 4 states, that's the impeachment clause, the president, vice president, and all civil officers, of which the Supreme Court is a member, they are civil officers of the United States, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And also under Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution, that reads in part, "The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior." There's been a lot of conjecture around what good behavior means, even interpreting the clause to indicate Supreme Court judges are appointed for life. That being considered, I can go along with them holding their appointments for a very ill-defined term, but only as long as they appropriately discharge the duties of their position, pursuant to Article 3, Section 2, and I quote, "Judicial power shall extend to all cases arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States." Ruling against a woman's right to privacy in making personal medical decisions with her doctor and basing that ruling inappropriately on and uplifting arbitrary religious reasoning are two instances of exceptionally bad behavior. Violating the Constitution certainly rises to a high enough level for a justice to be impeached. By the way, I do not believe any public office holder or official, judges included, elected or appointed, should be able to hold office for life. The judiciary and Congress both are in need of structural and process reforms, part of which needs to be defined term limits. We'll talk more about these things further down the line. So moving on to our last topic, let's look at a couple of overlapping societal issues connected to abortion. That's adoption and social services foster care. We hear a lot, mostly from anti-abortion groups, about adoption as a really great alternative to abortion for unwanted pregnancies. And personally, I've been pretty skeptical of that claim, but I have to admit I didn't really know a lot about it either, except for occasional news stories related to foster care, usually gone bad, or adoption being talked about tangentially in abortion-related news. But I did learn a lot in my research, and now I might say I'm probably a little more cynical about it than skeptical. First, I want to make clear that coping with an unwanted pregnancy and choosing abortion does not mean that the woman or the couple doesn't want children, or that it's a matter of convenience. It means that for whatever reason, the situation, medical or otherwise, they find themselves in at the time is unstable or untenable in some way, and adoption just might not be the best or the most viable path for them. And in regard to some of the statistics we're about to examine in this section, a few of the sources state that they're a little unsure about the impact the COVID pandemic may have had on the numbers. That said, the U.S. population is about 332 million people. Only 2% of them have adopted. So it would seem that for a lot of people, adoption is not on their to-do list, not even for those that are advocating for adoption. Now, this is an overall number. It's not a per year based statistic. So if one is considering adoption, what all is involved and how much will an adoption cost? Well, the likelihood is you will go through a state agency or a private agency. And then there will be about a 6 to 10 step process, depending on which state you're in and what agency you choose. You'll have to decide on professional services, what type of adoption, and there will be a required home study. There'll probably be about a 6 to 10 step process there. As far as cost, going through a public foster care agency is usually the least costly. Runs between $2,600 and $3,500, depending on the state and of course, the situation revolving around the child. Could be variable, a little more, a little less. For a licensed private agency adoption, it's between about $35,000 and $50,000, with the average being around $40,000-$45,000, but it could also be as high as $60,000 or $70,000. For an inter-country adoption, it would be in that same range, but a little lower, possibly $25,000 to $60,000. Statistics also show that costs to adopt dark-skinned children as opposed to Caucasian children is thousands of dollars less. The costs also drop about $600 to $800 for each year of age, as older children are less attractive to adoptive parents. And children with physical or developmental issues, the variation in cost can be up to 75%. So besides being relatively expensive for the average family, there seems to be some considerable bias in the system. So how many kids actually get adopted? Well, there are several sources for numbers, but the most complete is the U.S. Department of Human Services, the AFCARS report. AFCARS is Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. The most current data, complete data available, is for the end of 2020. There's a lot of information in this report. It's multi-pages. If you want to see all of it, just type AFCARS into your search engine. It'll get you to their website and you can download the entire report. They actually have years of reports, so you can go back in time and look at the information. So moving on to our numbers from this report. Number of kids that were in foster care at the end of 2020 was 407,493. The number of kids that entered the system that year, 216,838. And the number of children that left the system, 224,386. Now, all three of those numbers were the lowest in the last 5 years. Probably one of those influences of the COVID pandemic. Historically, more kids enter the system than leave the system. So this was an unusual year where there were slightly more kids leaving the system than entering. The number that were adopted in 2020, 57,881 from the foster care system. The number waiting to be adopted at the end of the year was 117,470. And they have to wait an average of 3 to 5 years for an adoptive family. Since 2015 to 2020, there's always been over 100,000 children in waiting at the end of each year. The numbers ranged from 109,000 to 125,000. So within the foster care system, the number of children institutionalized in 2020 was 22,824. There were 4,831 children for which the system was very unappealing and they ran away. And there's no data as to whether any of those children returned to the system. And 17,299 of them emancipated. They aged out of the system. The next set of numbers are probably a little more relevant to the abortion issue. And these are children from birth to 1 year old that entered the foster care system. In 2020, that number was 43,694. The number of children, infants that left the system is 8,965 for 2020. And the total number awaiting adoption was 3,854 at the end of 2020. Now, that 8,900 number of children exiting the system is not all adoptions. Some of those children were returned to their families or a close relative. On any given day, there are over 400,000 children in the foster care system. And over the course of the year, the system will handle well over 600,000 children. Now, here are a few other important numbers. The average number of adoptions in the United States each year is 140,000. About 57 to 59% of those children will come from the foster care system. 26% will be from other countries and other non-foster related situations, and 15% are non-fostered U.S. babies. That's 21,000 babies. Now, there's quite a list of people wanting newborns, as many as 1 million people waiting to adopt newborn children. And their wait is usually a year or more. So total of the number of 140,000 adoptions, 103,600 roughly are U.S. born children. And that's a fair sized number, but don't forget, on average, there's also over 100,000 children in the foster care system alone still awaiting adoption as well. The number of babies born each year in the U.S. is approximately 3.7 million on average, and that's been consistent for the last number of years. Also from the CDC, we have a report that since 2012, the average number of abortions in the United States has been over 600,000. In 2020, it was 630,898. So, what can we discern from all of this data? Well, studies show us that 20% of children aging out of foster care will be immediately homeless. So of that 17,299 that left foster care in 2020, 3,460 of them were immediately on the streets. I think it's a bit of an indicator that foster care doesn't necessarily prepare these children to move out into adult life on their own. The study also tells us that only half of them will be employed by age 24. So what happened to the other 8,650? Well, we know 3,400 of them were homeless immediately when they left foster care. So the remaining 5,000 there may join them on the streets, or they'll move into the welfare system in some way, or possibly they'll turn to crime. There is a possibility they will get more education, but that is the smallest proportion. Also, the research shows us that 7 out of 10 girls that leave foster care, age out of foster care, will be pregnant by their 21st birthday. On average, the system is about 50-50 boys and girls, so we're talking around 6,055 pregnant young women. And considering the data we have, how many of them do you think will be in a stable, secure situation where they could birth and raise a child? Also, in regard to that last number, 6,055 pregnant young women, it has not escaped my attention that many of those advocating abortion bans are also the very same people who want to block sex education in schools and restrict access to birth control and reproductive health care. That would seem almost ironically funny if it wasn't such an ignorant thing to do and had such serious consequences for so many innocent lives. Given the facts and evidence here, I think we could say the foster care system helps a lot of kids to varying degrees of success, but it certainly doesn't help all of them, and definitely fails some altogether. Almost 5,000 kids ran away in 2020. This is at least partly due to the sheer scale of the problem, though. They're trying to meet the needs of over 400,000 children every day, and they have limited personnel and limited budget. Even though the U.S. Administration for Children and Families that oversees the foster care system is the second largest government agency with a $69 billion budget, only 9.8 to 10 billion goes to foster care. And it's just not enough to cover all the expenses of caring for the children and keeping the system operating. So the potential addition of another 600,000 plus children, if abortion is made illegal and criminalized, adding that to an already overloaded system, it's not just a bad idea. It seems kind of sadistic. As for adoption, I think it's a viable but narrow option for a limited demographic. And given the obvious biases and the profit motive, it would appear that the focus may not always be kept on what's best for the children. In my research, I looked at a lot of adoption services websites, and I found the information to be occasionally somewhat opaque, occasionally contradictory. But one consistent thing was the message to the birth mothers, and that is that all services are available to them at no cost. Lots of bright, smiling photos of pregnant birth mothers and happy adoptive families, but no mention of the potential trauma and stress of going through a pregnancy and a birth process and giving away your baby, and the potential even for PTSD. While on the birth mother side of the adoption equation, costs are zero, for the adoptive parents, it can be as high as $70,000. But we do have to remember, this is a billion-dollar industry in the United States with hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, and it mostly revolves around the adoption of newborn babies. One agency I saw claimed it handled 300 adoptions a year. And at a median rate, say, of $45,000 per adoption, that's almost $15 million in gross income for that one agency. So it has to make you wonder, who finances all of this anti-abortion activity and the adoption advocates? I mean, there's some real motivation for the industry to want to channel babies into the supply chain. It's an unregulated industry. And also, I have an NGO report that shows that the United States, per 100 live births, has the highest adoption rate, as high as 15 times some other countries. There's only 2 countries that come close to the United States, and they have 1 adoption per 100. We have 3 adoptions per 100 live births in this country. And of course, when you multiply that times 3.7 million live births, that's a lot of babies. This is an unregulated industry, and to me, it almost borders on legal human trafficking. So, what do you think? Does it make any sense to deny people their constitutionally guaranteed rights to make personal and private decisions about how to manage their own reproductive health care? And does it make any sense to allow states to criminalize them or to criminalize their doctors and the healthcare professionals that are only trying to help them achieve the best possible outcome? Does that make any sense? Does any of that make sense? No, it does not make sense. So if you agree with any part of this assessment, then you need to speak up and speak out to your local, your state, your federal officials. Speak to your church groups. Speak to your social network. Speak to any group you're involved in. Encourage them to act to protect a woman's right to choose for herself. I think we're done with this conversation for now. Whatever you do going forward, do it from the heart. We'll talk again.